నీరు నిమ్మల కింద గన్నెర్ల కింద వంగి పూలే రంగ కొంగందుకునే వంగి పూలే రంగ.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We come to the third session of HLF 2021. In this strange times, we are doing this online, and we are delighted to have somebody who does not really need any introduction, Dr. Amitav Ghosh. And I'm lucky in a way because the two sessions that I was involved with this evening had two people who don't need any introduction. So my job is a little easier because I don't have to really introduce them. Dr. Ghosh, we are very thankful to you for joining us this year. And we know that this is the time usually you are in the US, so we have never been lucky enough to get you to HLF earlier. But fortunately, technology has helped us to bring you to HLF. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have this evening Dr. Amitav Ghosh in conversation with Minakshi Thakur. And as I said, I'm sure all of you are here because you already know who Dr. Amitav Ghosh is. So I don't have to really introduce him, except to say that he's the author of nearly 15 books, both fiction and non-fiction, and the only Indian writer writing in English to be conferred the Jnanpith Award, and several, of course, Padma Shri, Sahitya Academy Award, and so on and so forth. And today he will be in conversation with Minakshi Thakur about his new book, new in the sense it is 2019 book, Gun Island. But more importantly, Gun Island has now come out in 3 Indian languages, that is Hindi, Marathi, and Malayalam. And in conversation with Dr. Ghosh this evening is Minakshi Thakur. Minakshi, again, wears many hats. She is a poet. She's a bilingual poet, writes both in Hindi and English. And she also is a novelist, recently published a novel. And she's a trained classical singer. And currently, she is the publisher of Eka, which is an imprint of Westland. And Minakshi is very keenly and eagerly involved with translation. And so we couldn't have asked for a better moderator for this session, which is about Gun Island and its translations. So once again, Dr. Ghosh, thank you very much for joining us. And I will now hand over to Minakshi, and I'll come back after 35 minutes or so into the session with audience questions. Thank you very much. And once again, thank you, Minakshi, and thank you, Dr. Ghosh. Over to you, Minakshi.
Thank you so much, Professor Kumar. It's really good to be back at the Hyderabad Literature Festival. I have very fond memories of being in Hyderabad in 2014, also because that's where my novel was released. Hoshang Merchant, the brilliant poet, had released it. So thank you for having me back again at this session. Dr. Amitav Ghosh is with us. Hello, Amitav. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Minakshi, and thank you very much, Professor Kumar, for your very generous introduction. And thank you for this invitation, and I'm very glad to be with you today.
It's been an exciting journey for us at Westland, working on the Marathi, Hindi, and Malayalam translations of your novel, Gun Island, which came out in 2019 in English. And these three editions, as the session calls them, are cousins of your English original. I will start by talking briefly about what your translators said about working on the book recently. Manisha Taneja, who worked on the Hindi text, and Ashlesha Gore, the Marathi translator of the book, they said that it was a surreal book, a very surreal book to work on in a very surreal time, referring obviously to the months the world was forced into lockdown by COVID. Did you, when you were writing it, see it as a surreal novel?
That's an interesting question. Many sort of surreal and uncanny things happened around the novel, so there was certainly that. I mean, like you'll remember, there's a section in it set in Los Angeles when there's a fire that advances towards the museum. And, that actually did happen. I mean, there was a fire that almost engulfed the Getty Museum. But the weird thing is that I wrote that section 6 months before it happened. So, all along there were these sort of strange and surreal and uncanny things happening all around me. I don't really even know how to account for it, honestly. But yes. Of course, I've done events with Ashlesha Gore and, with Manisha Taneja, and they did mention this, and certainly I can see why.
Yes, because I wanted to ask this question because the core issues that the novel talks about are very, very real and pressing. They couldn't be more immediate than they are. So that's why I wondered if you thought it was surreal. Yeah, go on.
No, I was just going to say, yes, it's certainly true that, the novel is about, things that are very pressing and very urgent and, these realities that surround us on every side.
So because we are talking about translation, reading your books, I've always thought that multiculturalism and multilingualism are important elements in your writing. They've always been. In the Ibis trilogy, you had your characters use words from many languages, for instance, Bengali, Bhojpuri, Persian. You also had words from a Chinese pidgin and Creole. These may have existed in the years of the Opium Wars. Do tell us a bit about your personal association with languages. Do your research and writing process involve translation of some sort at many levels?
Well, I grew up multilingual, as indeed most Indians do. I mean, that's normal for us, I think. I think it's very hard, actually, to exist in India without being multilingual, because most of us, we speak one language at home, we speak another language in the streets, we speak yet another language at work or in school or whatever. So all of us grow up multilingual in that way. And I think this is the great strength of Indian writing, that we deal with this reality, which is increasingly a global reality, everywhere in the world now, people are to some degree multilingual, except for the English-speaking countries, which are the last remaining monolingual countries, which has not been a great benefit to them at all, if you ask me. So yes, for me, this multilingual aspect of being Indian has been a very important part of my literary work, I would say, And as I said, again, I do think of it as a strength. And, I do actually do quite a lot of, reading and translation, if you like, before I sit down to write. And particularly in relation to Gun Island, it grew out of a concern that I've had ever since I started writing my book, The Great Derangement. I've long been thinking that, if we are going to respond to the challenges that we see around us today, then we have to find other modes of literary expression, because the modern novel, as I've argued in The Great Derangement, in many ways is not capable of responding to what we see in the world around us today, So, I decided that I would start reading, non-modern literature, pre-modern literature, if you like. So I started reading the Bengali Mangal Kavyas, and one of these Mangal Kavyas is called Padma Puran, and it's actually the story of Manasa Devi and Chand Sadagar, And it was in reading this book, it was in reading this epic poem, really, that I conceived of the idea of Gun Island and, the interconnections between these various characters and so on. So, yes, reading in other languages is a very essential part of my practice.
Yeah, I was going to ask you where you found that story of Chand Sadagar later in the conversation, but it's interesting. I also, since we're talking about translation and how different translators approach translations differently, also editors and translation theorists, they often grapple with whether to domesticate a translated text to conform to the reading tastes or standards of the audience in the target language, or to leave it to the intelligence of the target reader to figure out what's foreign and unique about the source text. What do you think of that? Because bringing a text to a certain global standard in case of English translations is always stressed upon. Global often suggesting homogeneity. What do you think of that?
Let me say first of all that, I really congratulate Westland and ECA for doing what they do. I think the whole business of translating in India really needed to be brought to another level, And, Westland has done this, and, you in ECA have done this, and I can see with the way that you've produced my books, the 3 translations, and the way that you've put them across to the public. These are very important things, The Sahitya Academy used to translate a lot of books, but, you would never see those books in bookshops, They would just, because, to translate a book is one thing, but to actually introduce it to the public is a completely different exercise, And it's really great to see that Westland has brought a kind of professionalism to this, to the endeavor. So I think that's a very important and necessary step. And of course, Westland isn't alone. Katha and others have also done this. And now, Penguin Random House also has various translation arms and so on. So, it's a great thing. I felt for a long time that, this was the next step, the next necessary step for Indian publishing, to create this kind of multilingual conversation about writing. As for translation and the theory of translation and so on, I have to say that I don't have a theory of translation, and I think most theories of translation are completely misplaced.
True.
I mean, whenever I read a theory of translation, it always seems to me, one always thinks, but So at the end of the day, translation is a kind of mystery. I think that's what we kind of have to accept, and either a translation works or it doesn't work. That's just the reality of it. And I don't know how one accounts for that. Really, it just completely depends on the translator. For me, it's really a mystery in the same way that all writing is a mystery. I mean, writing a novel, at the end of the day, there is something mysterious about it. What gives the novel life? It's impossible really to say. I don't think anyone can really explain it at the end of the day. But I'll tell you, my new book, which is to be published next month, is called Jungle Nama. And again, it's an adaptation of a Bengali folk tale, which also exists in textual versions. But it's an adaptation in verse, and for this verse form, I've actually used a Bengali verse form, a Bengali meter called Dvipadi Poyar. These are couplets of 24 syllables, or between 24 and 28 syllables, something like that. So I've used this quite strict metrical form and adapted it to English, and that in itself is a kind of really exciting thing to do, to bring the rhythms of another language into English, and that was a huge challenge, but it was very exciting. And now I've always worked quite closely with my Italian translators, and they've been sending me their translation of the verse meter, and they've translated it into Italian using the same meter. And it's actually completely astonishing, I mean, it reads as if it were written in Italian, it's an extraordinary thing.
This is what I was going to ask, actually. How many languages have your previous books been translated into internationally?
Altogether, I think it's somewhere between 35 to 40, something like that, I think. But if you consider that India alone accounts for 18 languages, then, the figure is not quite as impressive as it might seem.
Have you received any peculiar queries or challenges from any international translator? A challenge that might have been very tough to resolve?
It really depends on the individual translators, like I never hear from my German translators at all, I never, even though, all my books are in German. But on the other hand, my Italian translators, as I said, I've worked very closely with. My translators in, my books are in both in Mandarin and in complex Chinese. And, those translators I've worked very closely with. They send me long lists of questions and so on. And, my Russian translator, again, sends me lots of questions. My Swedish translator, again. But again, some other translators I never hear from at all. So I don't know how one explains that. But whenever I do hear from a translator, I always take that to be a good sign. It means that they're really sort of getting into the text and, are really investing themselves in the text. So I like working with translators, and I always go to a great deal of trouble to answer their questions, which are often extremely difficult to answer. I mean, how do you explain to someone who's translating into Russian, let's say, a word like badmash?
You spoke a little about this earlier, but I wanted to talk a bit about the Great Derangement. It came in 2016. And after writing nonfiction on how we cannot pretend anymore that the climate crisis does not exist, what led you to take it up again in fiction? Do you think fiction has an ethical imperative to inform and educate? I guess the larger question would be, do you see that as being art's most crucial purpose? Because fiction especially is seen as a very private, it's a private consumption experience in some ways, whereas a work with an ethical pursuit would want to affect the collective consciousness of human culture.
Those are very good questions, Minakshi. I mean, well, let me answer in several parts. When I was writing The Great Derangement, I often said to myself, my goodness, I'm explaining why climate change is difficult for novelists. And I'm a novelist, you know, am I going to be able to meet this challenge? And I didn't really know, but, you know, I started working on Gun Island very soon after I finished The Great Derangement. And, you know, it was a very exciting book to write. It was very, you know, writing can often be extremely difficult, but for Gun Island, it was just exciting, really thrilling to write that book. And I think I met all the challenges that I had set for myself, you know, because in The Great Derangement, I lay out all the challenges that a fiction must meet in today's age. One is that we can no longer write about just one place, you know, because what's happening is not limited to localities. You know, it's a global phenomenon. It's a phenomenon that creates deep interconnections between different places. Secondly, I think you know, we have to cover large spans of time. You know, because there again. You know, the phenomena that we see unfolding around us are imbricated in very large spans of time. So in those ways, at least, I felt that Gun Island was responding to those challenges. The other question that you've raised here, this question of you know, fiction being or literature becoming very privatized. You know, very, very personal, very individual. I think that's a very interesting and important point, you know. See, it's only in the late 18th century that people started reading in silence. Before that, people never read in silence, you know, you always read aloud. Yeah. Reading was always a collective, endeavor, you know, it was a collective experience. Today, today, one of the real challenges that faces us today is the complete individualization of literature. You know, on the one hand, you have the writer working alone as an individual, you know, producing these texts which are in some way rooted in their individual inner life. And on the other hand, you have the reader who's reading as an individual in silence, you know, completely cut off from other people, you know. Again, it's the whole idea of reading in that way is to connect with an individual, you know. Now you think about our older texts, you know, the pre-modern, or we might actually, I would say, rather than pre-modern, because that implies a sort of, you know, a sort of linear conception of time. I would rather say non-modern, you know, because modern is just a genre, really, at the end of the day. So if you think of non-modern texts, they were not individualized in this way. I mean, say, for example, the story of Monasha Devi, you know, that's being told by, you know, dozens of Bengali poets from the 14th century onwards, you know, and all of them conceive of themselves as working in tandem with each other. You know, they're all relating to each other's works. So these were not individual texts in some sense, you know, even though they are individualized. It's not as if the authors don't register their names. You know, they put their names into the text, their name, their jati, their father's name. They put all of this in the text. You know, but again, at the same time, their text is about a story that already exists, that far pre-exists them. You know, and which has already been told by many different people. Secondly, these texts, and this is what is so interesting. I mean, you as a singer, I'm sure will understand this, that, you know, every passage or chapter, you might call it, actually has a rag specified. Each of them is actually meant to be sung or chanted, and each of them is meant to be listened to, in a collective setting. So, these provide us with some pointers for how we can work. And for me, this was one of the very important aspects of writing this book, Jungle Nama. I wanted it from the beginning to be a collaborative text, So most of all, if you look at non-modern texts, they always include imagery. They always have illuminations, they have pictures, they have images. And I think the absolute logocentrism, the complete focus on the word to the exclusion of images of all kinds is again something very new. And I think it's again something that shuts us off from the world around us. So I wanted to include imagery in the text, So very early on, I wanted to collaborate with an artist, and I was extraordinarily fortunate in that I collaborated with one of the most talented artists of the younger generation, Salman Toor, who's just had he's set records quite recently for his auctions. He's had a huge show opening at the Whitney Museum in New York. So it was an incredibly exciting collaboration, And I also wanted this text to exist as music. So I've collaborated with a young musician, Ali Sethi, incredibly talented.
Yeah.
And you'll hear a little excerpt from it at the end of this. So it's ongoing, our collaboration, but I think what's going to come out of it will be completely marvelous. Again, it's a text that will exist in these multiple iterations, which is exactly how non-modern texts existed.
The Sunday Times London, in its review of Gun Island, mentioned that it's a Bengali Da Vinci Code. I didn't know what to make of that. I'm curious how you reacted to that comparison.
People should things. I have no strong feelings about it. Well, one thing is certainly true is that Gun Island is a kind of it's a mystery, but in the case of Gun Island, it's actually an etymological mystery, built around the word banduk and banduk dweep, which are etymological mysteries. So yes, it's certainly a mystery of some kind.
Places, cities and towns, they're almost like fully formed beings in your work. They have a strong looming presence of their own. You've written about the Sundarbans and the Hungry Tide as well, about Egypt in an antique land, and Burma in the Glass Palace, and so on. The location is not just a setting, but it seems to me that it's an important vehicle for your stories. They're like homes for your stories. You yourself divide your time between so many places: Brooklyn, Goa, Kolkata. What does the word home mean to you? Is it an idea that you interact with constantly in your imagination?
Well, at the end of the day, home is, for me, home is where I have a study where I can sit down and write. That exists now in several different places. I think this aspect of, engaging with many different places has been very important to my work, And it's actually been very important for many modern Indian writers, I would say. I mean, look at Rabindranath Tagore. I mean, he was so much rooted in Bengal. And yet, travel was incredibly important for him. He spent, a formative part of his youth in London. And then, he was just a constant traveler, to China, Japan, to South America. Similarly, many Indian writers, I think often of Gopinath Mohanty, the great Odia writer, who actually spent his last years in California, I think it was. So I think this is an aspect of the contemporary Indian experience, and it's certainly been been my experience from childhood onwards of, being spread over many different parts of the world, or certainly many different parts of the Indian subcontinent. And so I like to think that it's kind of really, it's sort of added something to my work. At the same time, I do think it's very important also, to read writers who are completely absorbed in a single place and who reflect, nothing other than that one place.
The goddess of snakes, Mansa Devi, and she clashes with Bonduki Saudagar and not Chand, but Bonduki Saudagar, the gun merchants in Gun Island. They seem like powerful forces of two opposite kinds that attract and then repel each other. What do they really represent in the novel?
That's a very interesting question. See, this story of Chand Saudagar and Monasha Devi is a very, very old story. I mean, it's indigenous to Eastern India. It's very deeply rooted in the soil of Eastern India. And I mean, it exists in Assam, in Bangladesh, in West Bengal, and so on. And it's, I think, one would say that it's sort of pre-Brahminical, I mean, it's sort of extra, it's sort of outside the normal canon of, Indian beliefs, if you like. But within Bengal, the Monasha Devi story is used to be, at least I would say, it was all pervasive. When I was a kid, we were constantly told the story, and the story again existed in multiple iterations. It existed as a jatra. It was made into films, and I was delighted to discover the other day that one of the most popular television serials in Bengal in recent years was based again on Monasha Devi. So, what does this story represent? See, on the one hand, you have Monasha Devi, and when we say that she's a goddess, it sort of implies that, she's sort of above everything, and like that. But that is not the kind of figure that she actually is in the texts. She's more like a translator. She's actually giving voice to various kinds of animals, most of all to snakes, but also all other venomous creatures, and also to natural events, to storms, to tidal waves, and so on. So she is, you could say that what she actually represents is that she represents the voices of non-human beings, What does Chand Saudagar represent? He's a merchant. And as a merchant, what he represents is the profit motive. So here you have a clash between someone who represents the profit motive and someone who represents the needs of non-human beings. And this story sort of conceptualizes this clash so clearly, that between non-human beings and the human needs, there must be some balance, So it was very striking to me that already, going back into deep antiquity, people had been able to conceptualize, what has become the reality of today, that, the human love of profit is actually destroying everything that is non-human, everything that is around us, the entire natural environment, it's eradicating all kinds of non-human species. We are living through this great sixth extinction. And all of it is conceptualized very early on. And this theme recurs again and again, even in the story of Bon Bibi, which is sort of the background of Jungle Nama. That again is the theme of how do you find a balance between the human and the non-human.
One person's mythology is another person's history, which we see, especially in India, that our epics and stories from our Puranas. We know where the Mahabharat war battle took place. Rama's footsteps from Ayodhya to Lanka have been traced in multiple books. We know the sites. There are people who believe that these things really happened and they existed. These people existed. How reliable is this story, Banduki Saudagar's folktale, that triggered all the events in the novel?
Well, Banduki Saudagar is obviously a fictional character, someone that I made up. But again, Chand Saudagar exists in many kinds of iterations and so on. And the story of Chand Saudagar similarly has many locations, traceable locations. I mean, there are ruins in Bangladesh and in Assam and in West Bengal that are linked, to the mythology of Chand Saudagar. Did Chand Saudagar actually exist? Who knows? We don't know. But certainly there are palaces. There are memorials. So perhaps there was some reality. But I think we should avoid this whole question that comes to us from Western historiography of trying to, as it were, produce a kind of a reality behind these legends and myths. I mean, we've seen in India how destructive that search can be. We have to live easily with the idea that, legends and myths give us something that history doesn't, and they don't have to be linked, to history in the Western sense. And, it's very important to recognize this, that Western history is one way of knowing. And it's actually a very limited way of knowing. Non-human beings have no place in Western historiography. Western historiography can't allow for creatures that don't use language. Because all their methods are fundamentally based in documentation, and documentation is always linked to language. So they could never have such a thing as a story of Manusha Devi, because Manusha Devi is giving voice to the non-human. Which is not possible within the boundaries of Western historiography. So it's very important for us, I think, to recognize that we should not privilege Western historiography in this way. It is not important whether Chand Saudagar existed or not. What he tells us, what the story tells us, is something completely different from the stories of historiography. Those are important. They have their own. They have their own place, but we should not imagine that history gives us an ethical basis for living, an ethical or imaginative basis for life.
Which brings me to your protagonist, Deen Datta, who keeps questioning the link between this folktale from the Sundarbans and Venice, which was beset by floods. Was that a conscious device, his skepticism? Are we all like Deen, who deny that a refugee crisis in Asia could be triggered by some superpower in the West, or centuries of climate abuse by developed nations might be affecting people in less developed nations who are seemingly not connected to it?
Well, I think skepticism is an important way of telling story. You'll see that a ghost story, for example, any ghost story, to be persuasive, will always have a skeptic somewhere in there. I mean, that's absolutely essential to to telling a good ghost story. So in the same way, I think skepticism is a necessary aspect of storytelling, and so and Deen Datta, he certainly represents a certain kind of empirical approach to the world. So I suppose that was his function there.
Dean's friend Pia, who is a marine biologist, who takes him to the Sundarbans. In a passage somewhere, she suggests that dolphins are being displaced from their habitats because their ecosystems are being encroached on and destroyed by capitalist forces. And then in the second half of the novel, you go on to trace the routes taken by refugees who leave their homes to cross borders that they are not supposed to cross. And when they cross illegally, they are left stranded like dolphins. Are we all human and animals in the same boat, or is what's happening to marine ecosystem now a sign of things to come?
What is happening to marine ecosystems, especially in the northern Indian Ocean, is absolutely catastrophic. You know, some years ago, I published an article with a marine biologist, Dr. Aaron Lobo, on dead zones in the Arabian Sea, and these dead zones have now a longer study has come out showing that these dead zones are expanding at a catastrophic rate. You know, in Goa now, there's phosphorescence in the sea, which is being caused by this organism called Noctiluca. There's been huge invasions of jellyfish, you know, in Panjim, right into the river, into the Mandovi River. It's kind of really shocking, the speed at which this is unfolding. And the same is true in the Bay of Bengal. You know, there's a huge dead zone which is spreading very, very rapidly. The magnitude of this catastrophe is literally unimaginable. You know, the Arabian Sea and the Bay of Bengal, this is the most heavily populated sector of the planet, you know. So these water bodies support hundreds of millions of lives. Their collapse right now is ongoing, and it's already having catastrophic effects, you know, everywhere, especially in India, but people just don't seem to notice, you know. I mean, you'll have seen all these stories about, fishermen from Tamil Nadu ending up in Iran, you know. Why is this happening? It's because they can no longer find the fish species that they need or that they were accustomed to. This catastrophe is going to displace hundreds of millions of people. It's going to take away the livelihoods of hundreds of millions of people. I mean, it's a catastrophe on a scale that is literally almost beyond imagining. And it amazes me that people, the media in India seem to pay so little attention to what is happening. You know, it's of the utmost importance that people pay attention to this. And in that sense, yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, the stranded dolphin and the stranded refugee are in many ways, they're counterparts of each other. You know, what we are seeing today is a displacement of people and animals and botanical species on a scale that has never been seen before. You know, it's literally unimaginable. So, you know, before I started writing Gun Island, I spent a long time in Italy, actually, speaking with refugees who'd come across the Mediterranean. And it was really kind of mind-boggling, actually. You know, there were very few Indians, actually, in those refugee camps. But there were large numbers of Bangladeshis and Pakistanis. You know, why? Well, one of the reasons is simply that those networks of international movement are much stronger in Bangladesh and in Pakistan. I mean, you know, the few Indians who you do find in these refugee camps tend to be Punjabis because they also have those networks of movement. You know, and I think this is going to happen on a greater scale. I mean, these networks of movement are going to spread throughout India, and and once that happens, you'll see mass movements on a scale never before seen. But it was very interesting to speak to these young men, and they're almost overwhelmingly young men, you know, between like 16 and 30, and the reasons why they move, what forces impel them on their journeys. Like a lot of the Pakistanis I spoke to in these refugee camps, they were from the Upper Punjab. And many of them had been displaced by the Jhelum floods. What were the Jhelum floods? I didn't even know. You know, even Pakistani friends didn't know what the Jhelum floods were. But in 2012, the river Jhelum flooded and drowned. Very large stretches of land. People found themselves completely unable to subsist on that land, and they just left. They left in their thousands, you know. Similarly, in Bangladesh, many of the people I spoke to, many of the refugees I spoke to were displaced by floods, by erratic rainfall, by saltwater intrusion. these processes are going on all around us right now. In Goa now, the working class is almost completely Bengali. Certainly from Eastern India, but very large numbers of Bengalis. I mean, in the last 10 years, to my astonishment, in the small village where I have a house in Goa, now there are Bengalis everywhere. On the one hand, there are Bengalis filmmakers and artists and so on, and on the other hand, there are people. There are builders, there are workers, so it's an astonishing demographic change that is ongoing in India right now, and nobody seems to be paying much attention to it.
About migration, Amitav, I wanted to ask Dean Datta. He is also a migrant, but he is a legal one. He lives in the US, returns to Kolkata every winter. He's also in a place that is not originally his home. Does the legal immigrant ever experience any of the fears of someone crossing borders illegally?
Oh yeah, all the time. I mean, every time I go to an immigration line, I'm terrified. I think that's a part of being Indian. I mean, there's this incredible anxiety that surrounds all our movements. Some years ago, my Romanian publisher invited me to visit Romania. So for that, I had to get a visa. This is one of the things that if you have an Indian passport, you get very used to this. And the visa lines in any consulate you go to in New York, I mean, they're like cattle pens. You almost expect people to come and beat you, with sticks. So you stand there for hours and you're just, you just feel that everyone is yelling at you all the time. And this actually happened to me. When I finally reached the window for this Romanian consulate, the woman began to scream at me for absolutely no reason, So I just looked at her and I took my passport and I said, no, I won't go. Why should I go? I mean, it's not like I'm dying to go to Romania, So yeah, all the time you have to deal with this, You have to deal with, it's one of the aspects of contemporary life, if you like.
There's an underlying contrast in this novel between man and nature and science and faith. And Dean Datta seems to be constantly caught in the middle of both of these. What role can faith play today if we admit that the climate crisis is knocking on our doors louder and louder each day? Can it help people of science or human society manage or avert any disasters?
I think we have to really make a distinction here, There are many kinds of hypocritical faiths, you might say, If you think of the forests in India being opened up to all these mining interests, people are just strip mining mountains. They're destroying the forests. And who are the owners of these companies? Often they are strict vegetarians who are very, who have great faith in, or profess to have great faith in this and that, and who claim they won't hurt any animal, while their mines are destroying the lives of millions of creatures of all kinds and human lives. On the other hand, you have the faith of the Adivasis. Just look at Niyamgiri. The tribe, the Adivasis of that region have sustained a decades-long struggle to preserve their sacred mountains. So for them, the sacredness of their mountains is very real. They actually believe in the sacredness of those mountains, and that is the basis of their struggle. So that kind of faith is one thing. The faith of urban elites, the faith professed by urban elites is, in many respects, I would say, completely hypocritical. I mean, there's they see no conflict between their faith and the destruction of the environment.
They're two independent things existing in isolation.
Yes, there's absolute cognitive dissonance.
Yeah. I was curious to know. I'm always wondering how Indian writers writing in English do this. In Gun Island, for instance, you have Indian characters like Rafi and Tipu, or the illegal immigrant construction workers you meet in Venice. Um, they should, in reality, be speaking in Bangla or Bengal, depending on where they come from. So my question is, do you, while writing, conceive what they say in English, or do you hear them in their native languages and then translate?
See, this is one of the problems, it's one of the fundamental problems of writing novels in a multilingual society, because the novel is a monolingual form. You can't put many languages into a novel. And yet, the characters in these novels often speak different languages. You take, any story that, so many stories, like Kabuliwala, for example. Obviously the Kabuliwala doesn't speak, his own language is something else, Pashto or something, but he ends up speaking Bangla, So how do you actually represent the diversity of languages in a monolingual form like the novel? You can only gesture towards it, because obviously you can't bring in 6 or 7 languages into a single text. So I think that's what one has to do to find ways of gesturing to a sort of multilingual universe while writing in a single language. So in my Ibis trilogy, I did this by using multiple dialects of English, Pidgin, as well as like Babu English and Sahib English, and all those various kinds of the Laskari dialects and so on. So one has to find some way around it. Actually, this is a problem that was addressed by Sanskrit theorists of art. And what happened? Their solution was often that certain kinds of characters would speak certain forms of Upper Brahmsa. So villains would speak, Eastern Upper Brahmsa. Other characters would speak the Western Upper Brahmsa, whereas other characters speak pure Sanskrit.
So Arunava will be working on the Bangla translation of Gun Island, and it'll be interesting to see how he translates Rafi and Tipu's language back to the original. Would you say that's what will happen? It'll be original, or would it be translated?
It'll be very interesting.
Wow.
Arunab Sinha, who's doing the translation, is an extraordinarily gifted translator. So I think he'll find the right solutions. But for me, I must say one of the extraordinary things about writing Gun Island was, some of the things that happened to Deen Datta also happened to me. I mean, I suddenly found myself one day, speaking to someone and recognizing that they were speaking the Madaripur dialect. Madaripur is a district in Bangladesh. My grandmother was from Madaripur, and she used to speak to me, in that dialect. And it was such an extraordinary shock, to be there in Venice and suddenly confront, this aspect of your past, just invading your present in this way. For some reason, a lot of the migrants are from these areas, Madaripur and surrounding regions. So that dialect, it's not just a language; it's a dialect of a language suddenly coming alive in those places.
The themes of displacement, loss, history, historical responsibility, they are recurrent in your work. The languages we use and how they evolve or get lost have a direct connection with social, cultural, or political or economic changes in a territory. And human migration affects all of these. In that light, do you see languages dying or surviving in a different form necessarily as being something unfortunate, or would you say that it is unavoidable and just a signal that we must adapt?
Well, we have to adapt. We have no option. I mean, in fact, these displacements are occurring and they're going to accelerate. One thing, though, we should remember, though I think it often gets lost in, especially in media representations of migration and so on. The Western understanding of migration is fundamentally a sort of 18th and 19th century things, and a phenomenon, and it comes from the European experience of settler colonialism, where settlers went off and settled in America or Australia and took over the land and lived there forever. So when they see, migrants from Asia or something coming there, their minds immediately switch into that register where they think, oh, these people are going to come here and settle and take away our land and that kind of thing. So it creates that kind of hysteria. Whereas, in fact, if you speak to the migrants themselves, most of them are not going there to settle at all. Left to themselves, what they would like to do is to follow a pattern of what they call circular migration. That is, they go there for a while, earn a bit of money, come back. So this is the pattern that migrants follow, for example, in the Middle East. All those migrants from Kerala, etc., who go to the Gulf and so on, they're not going there to settle. They go there to earn some money. They send the money home. They build a big house or whatever. While over there, they live in terrible circumstances, often in horrible barracks and so on. But so Indian migrants have traditionally always, South Asian migrants have always had that idea. Even indentured workers, they often wanted to return. Not many did return, but that longing was often there for them. So this is the way that people are actually adapting, to the problems. I mean, if you look at the displaced people in the Sundarban, what they do typically is that they'll go to the West Coast or they'll go to a big city or somewhere, but they'll also have a little house in the original village to which they'll periodically return. So in effect, what they're really trying to do is to hold on to two sort of locuses of existence, and this is a very common thing in India. If you look at Mumbai, so many of the workers there are from Ratnagiri district, and they go in and out, in a constant pattern of circulation. So I think in reality, what we think of when we think of as migration and displacement, they're not absolutes. What people are trying to do as their lives become impossible in a certain place, they're trying to preserve some semblance of that life, because it's not just a place, it's a community, it's a way of life and so on. So they may go away and work in, let's say, Goa for 6 months, but then it becomes very important for them to return. So I think that's going to be the ways in which people will try and preserve some semblance of life. I mean, that's what I do. I spend time in New York, and then I also spend time in Goa. Both are very important for me.
Meenakshi, can we take a few questions?
Yes, please do.
There have been a few questions, but I'll take the ones that are directly related to Gun Island. The first question is by Varun, who says that most of Amitav Ghosh's novels don't have happy endings, but Gun Island, how do you explain the kind of divine intervention at the end of the novel and the kind of Bollywood kind of happy ending of Gun Island?
I don't know that I would call it necessarily a happy ending. I mean, someone dies. But her death is presented not in a negative, but in a positive light, And I wouldn't at all say that there's a divine intervention. I mean, there is a kind of, there is something uncanny that unfolds there, And that's the world we live in today. It's sort of saturated with all kinds of uncanny events.
Yeah, the second question is from Akanksha, who is asking, since Gun Island is not a sequel to The Hungry Tide, why is it that some of the characters from The Hungry Tide are revived in Gun Island?
Well, I didn't begin writing Gun Island thinking of those characters and those questions, but somehow, once you finish writing a book, it's not like the characters just vanish. They're still alive in your head, and they're still alive in some sense in the world outside. So slowly it happened that they just came back, and it was wonderful actually to revisit them so many years later and to think of the new directions they've taken.
Is it also because what Meenakshi was asking earlier about the location? I mean, since both novels are located in Sundarbans, so it's only natural that some of those people still survive there.
Actually, that's absolutely true. How could they not come back?
Correct.
Since I'm writing about the Sundarbans and they're there, how could they not come back? And that's actually what happened. I mean, at a certain point, I realized I can't pretend that I had these characters. I mean, they were there.
Christina Joy is asking, whether this is a correct perception that all your works from Shadow Lines to Gun Island revolve around the idea of national identities. Would you say that's a fair reading of your writing?
I would say that that's not the case at all. I mean, my novels are not at all about national identity. I mean, Hungry Tide is about, a region that is transnational. The Sundarban exists in Bangladesh as well as, in fact, I would say that really all my books are about, are in some way, one way or the other, that they're transnational. That was true of the Shadow Lines as well. Right. I mean,
I thought that was the very meaning of the title.
That's right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
One more question is from Arun, who says, when there is a request about translating your work, what kind of things you take into account before agreeing to it?
Well, first you have to consider whether there's a sort of a reputable publishing house behind it. Whether the translator has a track record of of translating, what other works they've translated, what their interests are. Those are the things you have to consider.
And I think the last question is about what is your take on some of your work getting into films? I mean, would you agree to it, or how do you see that as another translation, or how do you see that?
Several of my books are actually under option by filmmakers. Shekhar Kapoor, for example, is working on the Ibis trilogy. I'm completely open to it, and if it happens, it'll happen.
Yeah, this is not related to Gun Island, but it is about an antique land in an antique land, and it says. This is Asiya Munir, who is asking, what made you follow the trail of the slave in an antique land?
Well, I can't say anything made me. It was just a story that I found very interesting. I came across it in these medieval manuscripts, the story of an Indian slave being taken to Egypt. And since I had spent time in Egypt as well, I became very interested in that, and I became interested in the connections between Egypt and India. So that's how the book emerged.
Yeah, thank you so much, Meenakshi. Do you have any other last-minute questions?
No, I just wanted to ask one last question, and then play the video, because then
yes, we will play the video after.
I just wanted to tell the viewers that we've been talking about Amitav's next book, Jungle Nama, which is out in February. It'll be out next month. Amitav, did it naturally emerge from Gun Island? Like, did you finish that one and start writing Jungle Nama, or was there a break?
I'd actually, I'd been working on this since The Hungry Tide. The Bonbibi story is an important part of The Hungry Tide, and that's when I got interested in it. And I thought even back then that I would one day do an adaptation. And sure, after I finished Gun Island, I felt more motivated to do it. But my notes for it really date back to The Hungry Tide.
Thank you. Thank you so much for talking to us, Amitav. We'll now, it was really nice talking to you.
Thank you, Minakshi. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Professor Kumar. This was a great pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And once again, we thank both Dr. Amitav Ghosh and Minakshi Thakur for this session. And we'll end the session with a short promo of Dr. Amitav Ghosh's next novel, Jungle Nama. And this will be played now. And ladies and gentlemen, we will see you tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. with another session of HLF 2021. And we'll end this with the promo. Can we have the promo, please? Thank you once again, Dr. Ghosh and Minakshi.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This realm was once under the sway of Dukhin Rai, a mighty spirit feared by all under the sky. He preyed on humans in a tiger avatar. Whomever he wanted, he'd take for his shikar. Under his rule, all beings shivered in terror. Day after day, they looked heavenwards in prayer. At length, their entreaties crossed the empty quarter. From Araby, there came two beings of great power. One was the mistress of the forest, Bon Bibi. The other was her brother, Shah Jongoli.
Thank you very much. We can't wait to see Jungle Nama. Thank you very much once again, Dr. Ghosh. I know this is not necessarily the most convenient time for you, but you have made time for us. Thank you very much. And thank you, Minakshi, for this session.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Minakshi. Thank you for your questions.
Thank you. Thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, with that, we end the day one of HLF 2021, and we'll see you tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. With a session on the biography of Hariprasad Chaurasia. This is by Satya Sharan, and she will be in conversation with Roy Chaudhary, Shantanu Roy Chaudhary, and this will be at 10 a.m. tomorrow morning. So once again, thank you very much, and see you all tomorrow morning. Thank you once again, Dr. Ghosh and Minakshi. Thank you. Thank you.
పున్నాము వెన్నెల కోలు పూసి కాసిందే కోలు
నీరు నిమ్మల కింద గన్నెర్ల కింద వంగి పూలే రంగ కొంగందుకునే వంగి పూలే